Hello and welcome to another episode of Reviews Redux, where I take another look at one of my older reviews and bring it up to my more current quality standards. Today I'm taking another look at Star Wars Jedi Knight Jedi Academy, originally released for PC, Mac, and Xbox, but later ported over to the Switch and PlayStation 4. What you're seeing here is of course the PC version. This is a first and third person shooter and the sequel to Star Wars Jedi Knight II Jedi Outcast. It was developed by Raven Software and published by LucasArts in 2003, first for PC and Mac, and a bit later on for the original Xbox, and it saw a port to the Switch and PlayStation 4 in March of last year. Upon its original release, it was generally quite well received, especially with regards to the multiplayer component, and the PC version was of course better received than the original Xbox version, but regardless of what the critics thought at the time, the game actually ended up developing a very devoted fan base that has actually kept the game alive to this day. Which is incredibly impressive for a game that's getting pretty close to its 20-year anniversary of release. Now sure, at this point finding vanilla matches of Jedi Academy is getting pretty difficult because the vast majority of servers out there are running mods like the Movie Battles mod, but that brings up something else that's really important to mention. Jedi Academy developed a pretty extensive mod community that developed not just things like character skins and such, but also some pretty extensive feature mods like JA+, or even more extensive overhaul mods like, of course, Movie Battles. And while Jedi Academy modding has waned in popularity over the years, and of course the player base along with it, there is still an active player base and there is still an active modding community that is either putting out updates for existing mods or introducing new content mods, and that is really impressive to see after, again, almost 20 years at this point. There really aren't all that many games that can instill that level of fan loyalty, so what is it about Jedi Academy that made that community such a long-lasting entity? Is it really that great of a game, or is something else entirely going on? Well, let's just go ahead and start delving right into it and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which is running on the Quake 3 engine, much like Jedi Outcast did, and in fact it features a lot of asset reuse from Jedi Outcast, and is really a marginal improvement over Jedi Outcast at absolute best. We're talking differences that are so slight most people aren't even going to notice them. Things like the texture work being very, very slightly better, or the shaders being very slightly better, and animations that were smoothed out a bit compared to Jedi Outcast. But other than the interface and heads-up display being a bit larger and easier to read, most people really aren't going to notice much of a difference between Jedi Outcast and Jedi Academy's visuals. And they're not going to notice much of a difference when they move over to sound design either. The soundtrack is still the venerable John Williams score, so nothing really to complain about there. But then you move over into the sound effects themselves, and they really just copy-pasted everything over from Jedi Outcast, maybe with some extra sounds here and there. But this also includes the rather weak explosion sounds that were present in Jedi Outcast, and the only new sounds you'll really notice are the ones for the concussion rifle, which are decent, but nothing particularly amazing. But then there's the voice acting, which is basically split between characters who return from Jedi Outcast and characters who are introduced in Jedi Academy. The ones who return from Jedi Outcast are basically the same quality as they were in Jedi Outcast, but then there's the new characters, most of whom are pretty bland and uninteresting, although to be fair, some of that is just due to the dialogue itself, not so much the voice actors' performances, although the performances really aren't that great either. So you end up with a lot more sourly delivered lines than you did in Jedi Outcast, and the result is voice acting that just doesn't work anywhere near as well as Jedi Outcast did. So when you bring all of the presentation together, you end up with something that looks very, very slightly better than Jedi Outcast, but other than that is more or less the same apart from the voice acting, which is definitely inferior. But of course what really matter are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is that you play as Jaden Kor, a prospective Jedi who has built their own lightsaber, and who gets embroiled in things far beyond what they were expecting right off the bat when the transport ship they're riding on gets shot down en route to the Jedi Academy on Yavin. Jaden and their new air quotes friend, Rosh Pennon, end up getting separated from the rest of the group and have to try to make their way back to the group, and in doing this, Jaden spots a small group of individuals using a strange scepter to siphon energy from the temple nearby. Jaden gets knocked out while observing them, but later gets rescued by a group of Jedi Academy personnel, including Kyle Katarn, and after informing the Jedi of what they found, Jaden is brought to the Jedi Academy, where they they, along with Rosh Pennon, are assigned to a master, in this particular case, Kyle Katarn, who has become a teacher at the Academy since the events of Jedi Outcast. After going through a brief training course, Jaden and Rosh are both informed that they will be sent on various missions that will count as their training, because the Academy apparently learns by doing, and thus you are introduced to the Mission Select screen, where you look into various requests for help that the Academy has received, and you can complete these missions in any order that you wish. And the initial set of missions give you an idea of how the game is going to progress from then on out. Throughout the game, you'll be given 3 sets of missions where you can choose the order in which you complete them. Each of these sets contains 5 missions total, and you have to complete at least 4 of them to be able to progress to the next story mission. Once you've completed that 4th mission, then you are given the opportunity to go back to the Academy and thus progress the story, or you can go back and complete the final mission in that set if you so desire. By the time you complete the second set of these missions and go through the required story missions after that, Jaden has been officially given the rank of Jedi Knight, and the rest of the missions from then on out have something to do with the story, whereas the previous sets of missions were only tangentially related at absolute best. You see, the main plot of the game revolves around a dark side cult calling themselves the Disciples of Ragnos, who are going around various locations in the galaxy and siphoning force energy from those locations with that scepter I mentioned. And the idea is that while you're gallivanting around the galaxy helping people out with these various missions, you are gradually learning more about the Disciples of Ragnos and what their nefarious plans are, and of course the ultimate objective becomes stopping them from doing whatever it is they're trying to do. It's certainly an appropriate plot for a Star Wars game, but the problem is it's not told in an interesting or even very effective manner. Like I said, the first 2 sets of missions are basically tangentially related to the main plot at absolute most. It's not until you've completed the first set of missions and you go on the actual main story mission after that, which is set in Hoth and feels very much an attempt at trying to do some fan service, and it's not very effective, that you really start getting actual progress on that plot. And unfortunately, the progress is basically, hey, it's the Disciples of Ragnos, and they're doing stuff, which we haven't figured out yet, so the main Jedi Knights and Jedi Masters are gonna go and investigate, and you just go do some more missions. The second set of missions has more cult involvement, but it's still only tangentially related to the main plot, so you're still not really getting much of anything during those missions, except for what you're being told in between completing these self-contained missions. Then you complete the next story mission after that and move on to the final set of missions, where the missions actually are more related to the main plot, but you're still getting tangential stuff. You're just investigating other things that the cult is doing, not really actively making much progress while you're completing those missions. And then you have the final set of story missions where the entire plot ends up resolving. It's a similar pacing problem as to what Mysteries of the Sith had, where almost everything that was actually relevant to the plot was backloaded to the very end of the game, and you just spent the rest of it just wandering around doing completely non-related or only tangentially related things. I mean, sure, it's handled better than Mysteries of the Sith, where it was basically the last 3 levels of the game that were actually relevant to the plot. At least in this one, it's peppered throughout. It's just that most of what you're doing is really not much more than filler content. I mean, don't get me wrong, they do some interesting things from a gameplay perspective, but narratively speaking, there's not really a whole lot going on here. It does give you the choice of 2 endings depending on how you've set up your powers throughout the entire campaign. If you go more light side or you have a balance, then you'll get the light side ending, whereas if you go more dark side powers, then you'll get the dark side ending. But neither of those endings are really satisfying conclusions to the entire plot, because you haven't really been treated to much of the plot the entire time you've been playing. It's mostly been that filler content style of play, and that just leaves you uninterested. It also certainly doesn't help that the characters they introduced for Jedi Academy, Jaden, Rosh, Alora, people like that, are just not interesting characters either. I mean, Jaden is an extremely bland protagonist, and the voice acting certainly doesn't help that, and Rosh is just downright annoying in almost every single scene he's in. But even the primary antagonists are just as bland and uninteresting. I mean, Alora is your very generic dark side apprentice, which is to say she is convinced of her own magnificence even though she barely even does anything throughout the game. And then the main antagonist is Tavion from Jedi Outcast, and she was barely even in Jedi Outcast, and she occupied basically the same role that Allura does in this, only in Jedi Academy. Now she's basically doing the exact same thing, only she's in charge. And all of that makes it very difficult to really get invested in the story of Jedi Academy. It also certainly doesn't help that they throw in a few moments that are clearly meant to be some sort of fan service, like a mission where you end up fighting alongside Chewbacca, or the mission where you go to Hoth and go to Echo Base. But unlike in Jedi Outcast, those moments fall flat when you do them in this particular game. And it's precisely because you're playing as Jaden Korr, not Kyle Katarn. You see, it makes sense for Kyle Katarn to be fighting alongside these familiar characters or going to these familiar locations, because he's part of that generation of characters. Based on what we know about Kyle Katarn and all the adventures he's gone on, it makes sense that he would be familiar with Han and Chewie. It makes sense that he would go up against characters like Boba Fett. In fact, Kyle already fought Boba Fett in the original Dark Forces, so it makes even more sense that he would do that. It makes sense that he would go to these classic Star Wars locations because they are in keeping with his history as a character. And that's what made moments like that work in Jedi Outcast. Sure, it was fan service, but it still made sense from a narrative perspective. When you move over to Jedi Academy, you're no longer playing as Kyle. You're playing as just some random person named Jaden Korr, who you know basically nothing about other than they happened to build a lightsaber before the events of the game. And throughout the entire game, you're going to find out that not only does Jaden have basically no personality to speak of, but there's not really anything that sets them apart other than the fact that they are player one. And it's that very problem that prevents these moments from being the kind of awesome Star Wars moments we saw in Jedi Outcast, and instead pushes them squarely into contrived and a bit cringy fan service. And all of that brought together makes the writing in this game just fall apart. Which of course means it's really entirely up to the gameplay to carry the entire experience of Jedi Academy. And for the most part, it is actually successful in doing this. I mean, the idea of multiple missions that you can complete in any order may be a bit of a nightmare from a narrative perspective, but from a gameplay perspective, it's actually a pretty decent idea. It's just that it's not handled in the best manner. You can't save while you're on the mission select screen, so you have to get into the mission before you can save, and that means if you select one of the missions that is an absolute stinker, like the one where you get captured and have to escape from a facility, then you either have to load a previous save and replay content from the previous mission, or you have to just go through the entirety of the mission you selected before you can get back to the select screen. Now, I will be fair and say that a mission select system like what you see in Jedi Academy was not in common usage at the time Jedi Academy was being developed, so they may not necessarily have known better, but it does still have a detrimental effect on the way the mission select structure works. Anyway, once you've selected your mission, you are given a loadout screen, which is another thing that's actually pretty interesting, where you can select what you start a given mission with. Now, you're always going to start with your lightsaber and your pistol, which in Jedi Academy has been reskinned to a DL-44 blaster pistol, but it sounds and functions exactly the same as the Briar pistol did in Jedi Outcast, so there's not really much to talk about there. But in addition to those two weapons, you will have 3 weapon slots that you can customize. You can select up to 2 guns, which can be the blaster rifle, the Imperial repeater, the flechette gun, so on and so forth. And whenever you complete a set of missions, then on the next set of missions that you'll have available, you will get additional weapons you can slot in there. And the 3rd slot is used for the explosive weapon, whether that be the detonation packs, trip mines, or the thermal detonators. And unlike modern games where the loadout effectively locks you into using one particular set of weapons, this game is still from the old school, so there's no limit on the number of weapons you can carry around with you as long as you pick them up from fallen enemies and such, and you can swap between all of them whenever you want. It's just that they don't carry between levels like they did in Jedi Outcast or the games before it. And while that might sound a bit disappointing, it's certainly not a deal breaker, although I'm not really sure why they couldn't just have you be able to carry the weapons between levels when you can do that effectively with the Force powers. You see, whenever you go into a mission, you're going to get an additional force point that you can allocate into one of the light side or dark side powers. Like in Jedi Outcast, each of these has 3 ranks, so as you continue to increase the power's rank, then it will increase in effectiveness. So for example, you'll start with the Force Grip just being a basic choke where it holds them in place for a moment, and then as the rank of the power increases, eventually you'll be able to slam enemies into things, or pick them up and drop them off of ledges, or things like that. Now there are 4 powers each for light side and dark side, as well as a set of core powers, which are things like your lightsaber offense and defense, your force sight, push, pull, stuff like that. And the core powers will upgrade automatically based on the mission set that you're on, but the 4 light side and dark side powers are free for you to choose what you want to allocate the points into. The 4 light side powers are Absorb, Heal, Mind Trick, and Protection, whereas the dark side powers are Drain, Grip, Lightning, and Rage. Now most of these return from Jedi Outcast, but there are some additions for Jedi Academy, namely Force Absorb, Force Drain, and Force Rage. Force Absorb basically takes incoming force attacks like push, pull, lightning, whatever, and converts that into energy for you to be able to use for your own force attacks. Force Drain allows you to siphon the life force out of enemies and use it to replenish your own health, and Force Rage depletes your force energy, and while that's being depleted, you'll do more damage and move faster. Now, I never really found all that much use for the new powers myself. I usually like to stick with Lightning and Grip and Heal, but Rage is the more useful out of the 3 because it's always nice to be able to move faster and do more damage. But regardless of which powers you choose, it is still a pretty cool idea to be able to select which powers you want to use, and that you're not limited to one side or the other. And once you've allocated your next force point and selected your loadout, then you are dropped into the mission and you find that it plays more or less the same as Jedi Outcast, but with some fairly significant tweaks. The first of which you'll notice is that this game puts a lot more emphasis on character customization and even lightsaber customization than you saw with Jedi Outcast. And of course it makes sense that you didn't have any real customization in Jedi Outcast because Kyle Katarn is an already established character. Jaden Korr, on the other hand, is a brand new character, one which you have a fair amount of customization options for. You can select your species, whether it be human, Twi'lek, Rodian, or Keldor, and while for some of these you are locked into one particular gender or another, for example if you select Twi'lek then you are locked into a female character, for others you are able to choose between a male or female character. Once you've selected your species, then you're also given the opportunity to customize their outfit from a selection of preset items, and these will actually vary a bit depending on which species you've chosen. And you can also customize your lightsaber to a fairly limited degree. You can select which hilt style you want, as well as what the blade color is, from a selection that does not include red. Presumably because, as we all know, the red lightsabers are for bad guys only. Anyway, you start the game off with a single lightsaber and the medium style, and after you complete the first selection of missions, you can choose either the fast or strong style to add to your repertoire. And then after the second selection of missions, you can select either to continue with a single lightsaber and get whatever other style that you didn't get before, or you can select dual lightsabers, in which case you can customize each individual hilt as well as each individual blade color, or you can select a double-bladed lightsaber, which is the saber staff that you see Darth Maul using, but in this particular case the game refers to it as a two-handed saber for some baffling reason. Either way, if you select dual lightsabers or the saber staff, then you get a completely different set of moves than what you're used to from Jedi Outcast, which is more or less what you got from the single lightsaber in this, except you get extra moves, and everything is much smoother and more responsive than you saw with Jedi Outcast. Remember how in my Jedi Outcast Redux I said it was pretty much the best lightsaber combat we had ever seen, and I only said pretty much because Jedi Academy exists? Well, now you understand why. They took the fantastic lightsaber combat from Jedi Outcast, and they refined it. Not only did they take the already fantastic single lightsaber combat from Jedi Outcast and refine it into something that's even better in Jedi Academy, but they also expand your options to dual lightsabers or a saber staff, both of which also feel pretty much as refined as the single lightsaber combat does. The only real problems with that from a single-player perspective are, of course, that you don't get a full selection of customization options like you do in the multiplayer, as well as the fact that you don't gain access to the dual lightsabers or the saber staff until basically the last third of the game. As far as more general issues with them, however, the dual lightsabers and saber staff require you to be more careful with how you use them. After all, the single lightsaber is quite a lot more versatile. You can select up to 3 different lightsaber styles, and the strong style can just power straight through both the dual saber and the saber staff. So the additional saber types take quite a bit of getting used to, and that's also why you don't really see them as much online. The selection of moves that are available to you also takes some getting used to, and some of them can leave you quite vulnerable, so you need to be really careful with how you use them. The new lightsaber katas, for example, where you press the primary and secondary attack at the same time, it drains a significant portion of your force energy and unleashes a very powerful attack, basically root you in place. You're not able to cancel out of those moves, and they have to go through the full canned animation before you are able to move again, so it leaves you wide open to attack, which is why you'll basically never see anybody using them online unless that person just has no idea what they're doing. Well, or if you're going up against bots, which usually aren't smart enough to get around it, but that's beside the point. Regardless of its shortcomings, however, this is still the absolute best lightsaber combat we have ever seen in a Star Wars action game, and it remains so to this day, which is both impressive and a bit sad, because this game is getting pretty close to 20 years old at this point, and we haven't even really gotten iteration on this system, let alone something that's outright better than it. But aside from the absolutely brilliant lightsaber combat, what about the rest of the gameplay? Well, the weapon selection is more or less the same as Jedi Outcast, except that the pistol has of course been reskinned to a DL-44, and you have a new weapon, or rather returning weapon, in the form of the concussion rifle, which was in Jedi Knight I and Dark Forces I, but it wasn't in Jedi Outcast for some odd reason. Regardless, in this, the primary fire shoots off a concussive blast that explodes on contact and does a huge amount of area effect damage, and the secondary fire is basically a railgun shot. It's a very powerful weapon that burns through ammunition very quickly, and it even knocks you back a bit when you use it, so it's something that both is powerful and feels powerful. But other than the refinements of the lightsaber combat, the new force powers, and the return of the concussion rifle, there wasn't really all that much done to the core gameplay of Jedi Outcast when it moved over to Jedi Academy, other than tweaks and refinements. And one of those tweaks was actually to remove the inventory system entirely. So for example, there are no longer Bacta canisters or anything like that, where you pick up the item and you can cycle through your selection of items and then just use them whenever you feel like. And frankly, there's not really any great loss there. After all, you have access to the Force heal power pretty much immediately, and the Bacta canisters were really the only item that you were using frequently in Jedi Outcast, so it doesn't really matter all that much. Now, if anything, the only truly negative change you'll see for the gameplay of Jedi Academy versus Jedi Outcast is the reduction of the dismemberment. It is still in this game, but it triggers a lot less often, and in order to get it to work like it did in Jedi Outcast, or especially to get the realistic saber combat that you saw in Jedi Outcast that just was an absolute joy, you have to go and do some config file edits instead of simply using console commands. And your mileage is going to vary on that. It doesn't always work the way it should, and I'm not entirely sure why. But other than the tweaks they made to the dismemberment system, there is one other thing they added to the game actually that doesn't really work all that well, and that is vehicles. You see, at certain points during the campaign, you are given the opportunity to jump on, say, tauntauns or speeder bikes or something along those lines, and the controls for them just don't work very well. You can swing your lightsaber in a fairly awkward manner while you're on these vehicles, and in the case of the speeder bike, you also get a blaster cannon on it that you can shoot directly in front of you, but good luck hitting anything with either of those. You see, none of the vehicles have any real lateral movement, so you're basically only going forward and having to use the mouse to turn the camera around and actually point your vehicle, and it just makes the vehicles fairly clunky. In addition to that, the blaster cannon on the speeder bike almost shoots directly into the ground, so you're basically never going to hit anything with it. And the lightsaber has such an awkward swing while on the vehicles that you'll probably never really hit anything with it either. So while it is nice they made an attempt to spice up the gameplay by implementing these vehicle sections, they just don't work very well. But despite its issues, the single-player component of Jedi Academy is actually pretty good from a gameplay perspective. It's just that you have to completely shut the story and the characters out of your mind in order to be able to enjoy the single-player. Because after all, it is entirely in the gameplay that the single-player component is enjoyable. But let's be honest here, the single-player of Jedi Academy is more or less icing on the cake. The real reason people played it, and continue to play it to this day, is the multiplayer. Although, ironically enough, it's not because of the expansive new mode they introduced to the game, which they were actually very proud of, called Siege, which is an objective-based mode where one team is on defense and the other team is on offense, and they have to complete various objectives in order to ultimately win the match. You see, even though I played this game back during its heyday, I only ever got into a match of Siege once, and while it was an enjoyable mode for its day, it was basically done better in other games, like, say, Wolfenstein Enemy Territory, for example. So people didn't really play the Siege mode of Jedi Academy. What they did generally play, however, were free-for-all and duel. And free-for-all partly because you have a sort of dueling mechanic in there, where you can challenge someone, and then they can accept your challenge, which will then allow you two to square off against each other without worrying about outside interference. You see, that's the really cool thing about Jedi Academy's multiplayer. Overall, it's a good multiplayer mode for its day. You can certainly enjoy the gameplay of the Siege mode, or just normal free-for-all, or capture the flag, or team deathmatch. But where Jedi Academy really shines is in that lightsaber combat, and that works best in free-for-all with all of the weapons except for lightsaber disabled, the 1v1 duel mode, and to a slightly lesser extent, the power duel mode, where one stronger duelist is going up against two weaker duelists. While we normally think of Star Wars games as aimed at a more casual audience, Jedi Academy's lightsaber combat actually has a pretty high skill ceiling, and you would end up with some surprisingly competitive play in Jedi Academy during its heyday. But the beauty of it, of course, being a Star Wars game is that it appeals to a huge audience, so it wasn't just the hyper-competitive people who got really good at that lightsaber combat who were playing it. It was people of all skill levels, and for the most part, the community welcomed that. It actually ended up being one of the best multiplayer communities I have ever seen in the entirety of gaming. And the fact that the game has stayed alive as long as it has is really a testament to just how good that multiplayer community is and just how good that multiplayer gameplay is. Now, unfortunately, if you try to play the game these days, you'd be hard-pressed to find a server that is not running mods of some description, whether it be something as simple as JA+, or something as extensive as the Movie Battles mod. And that's in fact why I haven't shown any Siege mode gameplay. You can't play that with bots for some baffling reason, and so you have to go online to play the Siege mode, and if there's no servers running the Siege mode that aren't modded, then I can't give you an accurate representation of what the Siege mode is like in the base game. All the other modes, however, are playable with bots, which is what you've been seeing throughout this, and you will notice that the bots in this game are not exactly all that great. They're decent for some casual fun, but you're not really going to get good at the game playing against the bots. So a first-time player going into this now is going to find the experience fairly rough. They're not going to get much of an opportunity to practice their skills before they go online against people who've been playing this game for a long time and have gotten very good at it. So unless you're playing the recent console ports, you're going to have to be very patient with the game and understand that what you're going into is a game that has a very high skill ceiling, and that you're probably going to get demolished until you've practiced the game enough to get good at it. But funnily enough, since there's not really a competitive scene for this game anymore, even if you are getting demolished online, it's not actually that frustrating of an experience. Sure, you're going to be frustrated with yourself a bit for not being better at it, but you're still playing Jedi Academy multiplayer. It's still a great game. And ultimately, despite its single player being something of a mess, and despite the online being considerably diminished compared to what it used to be, Jedi Academy still holds up at a 4 out of 5. I still very highly recommend it, especially if you are already a fan of the Jedi Knight or Dark Forces series, but even if you're a Star Wars or action game fan in general, then you'll probably find something to like here. Thanks for watching, and if you like the kind of videos I make, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Every single cent from that goes directly back into the channel, whether it be getting more games for review, or additional equipment, or replacing broken equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.